Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So this week we're going to be doing another one of our genre-themed week. We've talked about tons of genres in the past, from fantasy and sci-fi to romance and thriller and historical fiction, even memoir. Today I'm really excited because we're actually looking at my genre and the genre that I write in, and that's literary fiction. Literary fiction is one of the more difficult genres to talk about because it's defined more by its qualities than by its content. So what is literary fiction? It is probably the hardest genre to define, and a lot of people will say, well, I know it when I see it. It's more of a quality that a book can have stylistically, which makes it a little tricky, but essentially literary fiction is character-driven fiction where the style and themes are just as important, if not more important, than the story. It's not enough to say that literary fiction is just character-driven fiction, like may have been said in the past. A lot, if not most, genre fiction, which is any fiction that fits a genre, so fantasy, sci-fi, horror, whereas literary fiction is basically fiction that is not genre fiction. Most genre fiction is also character-driven nowadays. You know, like Game of Thrones is fantasy. I don't think anyone's gonna argue with me that that's fantasy. But it's really character-driven, and more genre fiction is becoming character-driven. So I wouldn't say that literary fiction is defined by its focus on character, because most of the time, fiction is actually character-driven. It's more that in literary fiction there is a priority on style, and it doesn't just mean, oh, the prose is really fancy. It kind of means the way the story is told is a crucial part of the story, maybe more important than its plot even. Literary fiction doesn't really have set plot elements, right? Like pretty much anything can happen, it can be about any type of character. It doesn't have to be contemporary and it doesn't have to be realistic, but it can be. A lot of the time people think literary fiction is the same thing as contemporary fiction, which is not true. Contemporary fiction is realistic fiction set now, and literary fiction can be contemporary, but not all of it is. You can have literary fiction that has magic in it. It can be surreal. It does not have to be set in the present day. It can be set in the past. It can be set in the future. When a lot of people think of literary fiction, they think of contemporary realistic fiction, you know, a story that takes an introspective look at a character or relationship dynamics. And that's true of a lot of literary fiction, but literary fiction can also be surreal and incredibly bizarre. This is why I like literary fiction. It's essentially a do whatever you want, right? Like, the whole purpose of literary fiction is that the style and the way that the story is told is prioritized. Because of that, there's a lot of room for experimenting. You're not restrained by really anything. The whole point of it is that it gives you the room to be experimental, which is why I love it. There are subgenres, but they're not as clearly defined. You might see things like coming of age, magical realism. Some literary fiction might be historical. I think if I wanted to draw the main distinction here between literary fiction and genre fiction, it's that genre fiction is about asking how characters will solve problems that they are presented with. Literary fiction is not really about watching characters solve problems. It's more about studying how characters react and what that means about the character. So in literary fiction, we're reading about the character to see what we can learn about them internally based on how they can react. Literary fiction is more of a character study, and there's not as clear of an end point. The goal is just to unpack something interesting about this person, whereas in genre fiction, it's more about evolving a character so they're able to achieve a goal. Like I said, it is ultimately a know it when you see it kind of genre, so the best thing you can do if you want to write literary fiction is to read it. If you're not really clear, I would go out and I would read 5 literary novels, and that'll probably give you a good sense of what the genre involves. It's hard to write a genre if you haven't read it, and that is especially true of literary fiction because it's a very amorphous thing that is very hard to describe. So as for word count here, you're looking at around 60 to like 110,000 words. There's a pretty wide range. However, literary fiction definitely is currently trending a bit shorter. Slim, efficient novels are kind of what's most popular right now in literary fiction, though some definitely do veer on the longer end. Alright, so let's talk about some tips for writing this genre. The first one is to think carefully about your form. Form is everything that you use to tell the story. So every story kind of has 2 core components. There's the story, so what happens, and then there's the form, which is how you tell it. In genre fiction, typically the form is there to be effective, but kind of invisible. Like, we're not focusing on the form, we're focusing on the story. Whereas in literary fiction, the form is actually a really core component. So I would think really carefully about your form. How do you want to tell the story? So let's say you want to write a book that's in second person. You should be writing in second person because it's an inherent part of the story. Maybe the whole purpose of your story is that your character is telling the story to themselves as a way to try and understand it and understand what happened. Second person would make perfect sense in that case. It would be an example of unity of form and concept. So I would think carefully about your form. This is everything from point of view intent, to writing style, to the character's voice, to how you format the chapters and scenes. And even beyond that, maybe you want to do something kind of experimental. That's totally cool as well, if it's done with purpose and it makes sense. Step 2 is to create a flawed character. It is really important in literary fiction to have a flawed character, because the whole interesting part of literary fiction is unpacking those flaws and seeing why they're so compelling. In genre fiction, flaws are more obstacles on the way to achieving the goal. Characters in genre fiction still need to have flaws, but those flaws are there so they have something to overcome, or at least try and overcome, so they can achieve their goal. Whereas in literary fiction, the flaws are like the point of the story, right? Like, we're reading this to look at their flaws. So a lot of the time in literary fiction, characters are way less rootable than in genre fiction because they're not really written to be rootable. They're written to be an example of a person, but it's more about really looking at a character from every angle. Not all literary fiction is a character study, but it is probably the most common. So literary fiction doesn't need to be social or political commentary or philosophical commentary. Of course, it can be if you want it to be, but essentially what you're doing is you're trying to create a situation and a character that will allow you to explore your chosen topic, whether that's more broad and social and political, or very specific and very personal to the character. So a lot of literary fiction maybe does have like a social or political point that it wants to make. That is totally valid, but a lot of the time, what you're looking at is a character. And in that case, you probably know what you want to say about the topic. On the flip side, maybe you're just writing kind of a character study. You want to know what you were trying to say about this character. You're kind of trying to explain and explore why a person might be like this. Find something unique, compelling, and vulnerable to explore about the character. Step number 4 is to write reflectively. Literary fiction tends to be much higher on narrative summary, internal reflection, and description. In fact, in a lot of literary fiction, a really significant portion of the book will be narrative summary and internal reflection. You want to take time to explore the ideas in your story, so don't be afraid of the more passive aspects of language, like internal reflection and description. Keep in mind that in literary fiction, the drive of the story is to unpack this character or to unpack this idea, which is why it's actually really important to have those reflective passages and give enough time to reflection. Because that's the point, reflection in literary fiction can actually be an active part of the story because it's furthering our understanding of the character or idea, which is what the center of the piece is about. This means less in genre fiction, where the purpose of the story is to evolve a plot and a character with that plot, which is why active writing is so important, right? But in literary fiction, what would be kind of passive in genre fiction can actually be crucial. Step 5 is to be purposeful in every choice that you make. Because literary fiction has such an emphasis on craft, like the point of literary fiction is to use writing craft, right? To explore an idea or a character. You want to be very purposeful in every choice that you make. Good literary fiction makes use of every single element of a story, so the plot, the situation, the character, the writing, and the form to do something cohesive. So every single time you do anything, whether it's write a scene or make a decision about style, you want to be doing that in a purposeful way so everything works together cohesively. Step 6 is to be specific rather than universal. Because literary fiction is often very idea-driven, it runs the risk of feeling vague or preachy. And this will happen if the themes or ideas are too broad. Keep in mind that it's actually very rare that, as a writer, you have something original to say on a theme. And I know that might seem dejecting or rude, but that's just because themes are so broad, right? Like, how often do we really have something new to say on love or grief? In the giant sense, I don't know, not that often. Everyone has something unique that they can say about a character or a specific situation. So let's say you do want to write about grief. It's going to be very hard to do that in the broad sense, but if you're doing it in the specific sense and you create a specific character with a specific situation, you'll be able to find something specific to say about that idea. Step number 7 is don't overthink your prose. A lot of people associate literary fiction with very complicated and dense prose, and that doesn't have to be the case. Style can be anything in literary fiction. If you think that the best way to tell your story is with a very streamlined, simple style, that can still be literary fiction. If you feel like maybe a more complicated style would suit your story, that can also be literary fiction. As someone who reads a lot of literary fiction, I'd actually say that most literary fiction veers more towards the streamlined style of writing, and the more like lush, flowery prose is actually a bit less popular nowadays. So many new literary fiction writers who are just getting into the genre and are excited about the genre get a little too caught up in wanting to sound literary, and they get caught up trying to replicate this idea of what literary prose is, which is very dense and full of imagery. And then what happens is they really overconvolute their prose, they only focus on the prose and kind of neglect the other aspects of the story, and they're also not writing in a style that's natural for them. No matter what your writing style is, you can use that style to write literary fiction. No matter how complicated or how streamlined it is, it's all good for literary fiction. So write in a way that is natural to you, rather than trying to write in a way that feels literary. There's no such thing as a singular literary style. It's more important to find your own style than trying to replicate your idea of what a literary style would be. Step 8 is to think of events through the lens of what they can show about the character. For all the talk about character, plot is not irrelevant in literary fiction. Because in literary fiction, plot serves the role of creating compelling situations and storyline that can serve as a vehicle to unpack the character or the central ideas. So as you're constructing a plot, you want to think about how this plot can explore the most interesting aspects of your character, or whatever that central idea you're exploring in your book is about. Step number 9 is don't be afraid to be weird. Lots of literary fiction, yes, is very reserved and realistic. It is what most people think of when they think of literary fiction. But I wouldn't say all or even most of it is. Some literary fiction is incredibly weird. The whole point of literary fiction is that there is no convention about story or character. I think too many people get too caught up in this ideal of what literary fiction is. They think about writing the most like reserved, subtle, highbrow literature, and they forget that, like with any genre, literary fiction is about having fun and telling an interesting story about interesting characters. I like writing just weird, cool stories about characters I find interesting. The only expectation is that something purposeful will be accomplished. And that thing can be as weird or bizarre as you want. And that leads me to my final point, which is focus on writing an interesting story rather than a highbrow one. Literary fiction readers still want compelling stories with compelling characters and, interesting drama. But I think the fact that literary fiction is usually associated with being like highbrow and award-winning can actually hold a lot of writers back from writing the story that they want to write. If you're writing a book and you're like, but is this Pulitzer-winning quality? You're not gonna have a lot of fun writing. This is way too much pressure to put on yourself while drafting. And this idea of what is highbrow is outdated. If you read a wide variety of literary fiction, you'll see that there's a huge variety in what literary fiction can be. It can be strange, it can be reserved, it can be bold, it can be subtle, it can be experimental. Like, it can be really anything. And so focusing too much on trying to fit this ideal of like highbrow literature is going to make the writing really unenjoyable. Ultimately, literary fiction is just like any genre. It's about telling an interesting story with interesting characters in an interesting way, with care to how the language and form support the story. A lot of the time, literary fiction is associated with elitism, and that can be true, but to be honest, I think there's elitism in every genre. Every genre has people who are elitist about the genre, including literary fiction, but it's not exclusive to literary fiction. But because a lot of people associate literary fiction with this like elitist quality, I think it can be easy to fall into that and feel like you have to create your story to live up to a certain idea about what highbrow literature is. The genre can be whatever you want it to be. That's the whole beauty of the genre. And trying to fit yourself into a really specific constraint actually defeats the whole purpose of what makes literary fiction so fun. A lot of literary fiction is fun or weird or comic even. So you can have fun writing it. You can write whatever strange story you want to write, and it can still be literary fiction, even if it doesn't feel like maybe what a lot of people would associate literary fiction with. So that is all on writing literary fiction. It's the hardest genre to describe what it is. So thank you so much for watching. We will have a second part to this series on Friday where we're going to talk about tropes in literary fiction, which I'm so excited about because it's the genre that I read, so I actually have like my own thoughts on the tropes. Thank you guys so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye!